Now that we've talked about the nature of intelligence and a little bit about the history as to how we started measuring intelligence, let's look at how we actually modernly measure intelligence. What do each of the tests that we use nowadays give us in terms of output, and what can we glean from this information? We can talk about the Wechsler tests, specifically the WAIS-4 and WAIS-5, which are the most popular individually administered intelligence tests currently in North America. These are a good place to start because if we remember what Wechsler was trying to do when he made the first versions of these tests, it was an attempt to look at more than just verbal intelligence. He wanted to look at other skills that related to intelligence, but not just verbal aspects. And so these tests consist of 4 different scales. One is a verbal comprehension index scale here in the top left. There's also a perceptual reasoning index scale, a working memory index scale, and processing speed index scale. These 4 indexes can all be combined to give a more complete, full-scale measure of IQ. Especially in cases where an understanding of an individual's IQ would benefit from more than just a number that says how generally smart they are. You are looking at something like a job application. Maybe having good verbal skills is going to be very helpful in a particular job. Or maybe having a very good digit span, a measure of working memory, would be especially helpful in a particular environment. So breaking down IQ into multiple subsets that each give you information on abilities in different areas, this might be useful if you're using it to determine if someone would be successful in a particular environment. Now, even though we've talked about the Wechsler specific tests, at the end of part 1, we actually mentioned that the Stanford-Binet test had also been overhauled or revised to include measures other than simply verbal intelligence. So that test will be broken down into other subsections again as well. So the modern Stanford-Binet test will yield that full composite IQ score, but will also give separate scores for verbal reasoning, abstract or visual reasoning, quantitative reasoning, and short-term memory. So very similar in layout to the Wechsler tests. But again, we might ask ourselves, what can we actually do with the output of these tests? For children who are given tests, specifically some of the Wechsler tests designed for school-age children, the outcome or the results of those tests might help shape how those children are educated. It might determine what kind of classroom they should be in or what kind of learning outcomes they should be striving for. If they're struggling in areas of reasoning, then maybe they should have lessons designed to help strengthen that area. As you can imagine, there have been tons and tons of tests that have been developed to test all sorts of different things. So we can talk about tests that were designed to evaluate specific theories, or even tests that evaluate aptitude. But let's start with the theory-based intelligence test first. If we think back to the cattle horn distinction between crystallized and fluid intelligence, we might not be surprised to realize that a lot of new tests have arisen to try and evaluate people based on fluid and crystallized intelligence separately. Tests like the Kaufman or the Woodcock-Johnson tests are fairly popular, especially in areas of education or job screening or even clinical applications. If you are hiring for a position where someone with crystallized intelligence would supposedly excel, then you might base your hiring process on someone's score on one of those tests. As new theories arise based on how intelligence might be divided up, new tests will also arise that are going to evaluate people's performance in relation to those different divisions. The next category of tests that we're going to talk about are aptitude and achievement tests. And these actually raise an interesting question. Should we be testing someone's aptitude for learning? Basically, should we ask their capacity for learning, evaluating, say, how they solve novel problems or how they approach new situations that they've never seen before? Or should we be evaluating someone's achievement? Should we look at how much they have already learned? Some of the support for achievement tests is that a student's previous achievement is usually predictive of their future achievement. If a student has done very well up to grade 6, then you might assume that they will continue to do well up to grade 12. So in that case, an achievement test might be a good indicator of future performance. The downside for these achievement tests is that there are some inborn assumptions to that type of test. And that is that everybody has the same potential for learning before this test happens. So consider standardized testing. Say all grade 6s are given the same standardized test, province-wide, and we're evaluating how much they have learned of the material up to that point. In practice, we know that across schools with different teachers and different environments, students are taught different material. Not everyone has been exposed to the same lessons, and even if they have had similar lessons, they're not delivered the same way. So not everybody learns at the same rate or is exposed to the same material. So in this case, achievement isn't necessarily testing the student's performance, it might actually be testing what they've been taught and who's been teaching it, which is really important to keep in mind. From that point of view, an aptitude test might be a more fair assessment of an individual's ability, because it doesn't rely on previous knowledge. It just looks at how they approach novel situations and solve novel problems. Again, there are drawbacks, because how can you be certain that this is a novel situation for someone? How can you be sure that they've never encountered a question like this before? So coming up with an aptitude test is a challenging task in and of itself. And there's extra complexity where certain tasks that you're presenting can't be confounded or mixed up with other variables. So it can't be restricted based on whether they've seen a particular shape before, or if they understand what a certain word means, or you get the idea. It has to be a type of task that basically anyone can do, no matter their experience. So it can't be restricted by their experience, and it can't be based on their experience. So it's very challenging to come up with appropriate aptitude testing questions. And this brings us to the state where most modern tests of intelligence end up having a mix of both aptitude-like and achievement-like questions. They're very hard to separate out. And that brings us to the idea that, well, if we're combining both types of tests, then we get both the benefits and the detriments of both types of tests. Where modern tests of aptitude and achievement are restricted based on exposure to things that students may have learned, whether or not they've seen something before, all of those issues that we raised with those individually. And so while we're on this track of critically thinking about these tests and what they're testing and any downsides to them, let's start talking about some of the psychometric standards for these intelligence tests and intelligence tests in general. So when we're talking about psychological tests, We're basically talking about a method for measuring individual differences related to some psychological concept. So when we're talking about intelligence tests, intelligence is itself the construct, and the scores that we're developing, the output of these tests, are a result of our operational definition of that construct. So for our intelligence test, we can operationally define what certain categories are going to mean in terms of intelligence. If someone scores an IQ of 100, then they are of average intelligence. That's part of our operational definition. If they're above a certain amount, then they fall in a different category. If they're below a certain amount, another category. So we have to operationally define the aspects related to these tests. So when someone is designing a specific kind of test, an intelligence test or an achievement test or an aptitude test, they're going to have to evaluate how good of a test is this really? How well is it getting at the construct or the concept that they're trying to measure? To evaluate how good of a test it is, we can look at three different measurement concepts: reliability, validity, and standardization. And these aren't specific to just intelligence tests or even achievement or aptitude tests. This is for tests in general, so broadly applicable. Let's start with the concept of reliability. The key point of a reliable measure is going to be something that is consistent, especially over time. We're going to talk about three key forms of reliability that are especially important for these kinds of psychometric standards, or our testing setups. The first of these types of reliability is the test-retest reliability. And this is basically where you take the same group of participants and you give them the same test at least two different points in time. You would then compare the results of that same test at those two different time periods and check out the correlation between those scores. If you have a high test-retest reliability, the two scores should be very similar and you should get a correlation fairly close to 1. If we use the example of an IQ test, if you test someone's IQ on Monday and they score 101, then if you test them again on Thursday, their IQ should theoretically still be 101. And if we see that same score at both times, then they have a good test-retest reliability for that particular IQ test. Now, we could consider what happens if we test and retest across a larger scale of time. Like, what if we tested a child at the age of 9 and then tested them again when they were 40? In one study that did exactly this, they ended up with a correlation between 0.7 and 0.8, which is fairly close to 1.0. So we could say that there's a pretty good reliability or consistency in IQ over time, even across 30 plus years. So this tells us that IQ is probably fairly stable, and we have a reliable measure of testing IQ. The second kind of reliability we want to talk about is called internal consistency. And this is basically looking at items within the test itself. So if you have an IQ test, then all of the different items that are measuring a certain category of IQ should all agree with one another. So here we have it said as all of the items of the test should measure the same thing. So if you have items that are meant to be measuring your verbal ability in terms of IQ, then all of the verbal type questions should be giving you about the same answer. They should all be relatively correlated with each other. If question 1 on your evaluation of verbal IQ says that you have a high verbal IQ, but question 2 still looking at verbal IQ says that you have a low verbal IQ, then which one is an accurate measure of your actual verbal IQ? In order to actually trust the output of that test, we would want internal consistency, where all of those measures that are testing the same thing would correlate quite highly with one another. So they would all agree with each other. That would give us just a little bit more faith in the outcome of that test. And our last type of reliability that we're going to talk about is inter-judge reliability. In other courses, I have referred to this as inter-rater reliability, where we're looking at the consistency of measurements when different people are scoring the same test. This is less of a problem if you're doing something like a multiple choice standardized IQ test, where you don't really have someone rating or judging your responses because they fall into those strict categories of A, B, C, or D. But if you're doing something where, say, a psychologist has to sit and evaluate your response, then your score can change depending on who's doing that scoring. If you have high inter-judge reliability, then an individual should be given a very similar score, even if a different person judges it. So we can look at this by comparing what one individual is scored at using one judge and what that same individual is scored at with a second judge. If both judges gave that individual a similar score, or if there's a high correlation between the two scores, then we can say that there's inter-judge reliability. They are consistent in the scores between judges. Next, we can talk about the concept of validity. And we can talk about validity as basically meaning the accuracy of a test. So validity is going to refer to how well a test is actually measuring what it was designed to measure. So if you've designed an IQ test, if it is a valid test, then it's going to give you a good measure of IQ. It's going to be measuring someone's intelligence. If you have an invalid test, if you've designed an IQ test that is not valid, then maybe you're not testing their IQ, but maybe you're testing their pre-existing knowledge, maybe like an achievement test instead. And so again, we come up with 3 different measures of validity that we care about. The first of these is construct validity. And construct validity is just asking if the test is really measuring what it's supposed to measure. If something had a perfect construct validity, then we could say that changes in the scores of that test were due only to changes in that construct. So back to our example of IQ tests, an IQ test with perfect construct validity would show differences in IQ that are only related to an individual's intelligence. In practice, this is almost impossible to observe because other things are going to cause a change in your score. So things like motivation or your educational background or your experience can all affect what you score on an IQ test. And none of those things are actually related to your intelligence. The next type of validity is content validity. And content validity is meant to ask if the items on the test are actually measuring the knowledge or skills that make up the construct that we're testing. So for our IQ test, do the questions being asked actually give us a measure of knowledge or skills that's related to intelligence? And not only that, we need to consider if the questions are giving us a full overview of the skills or knowledge that are making up that construct. So if we have our IQ test, if we have content validity, we would be asking lots of different questions that test or measure all aspects of intelligence, not just one part. So we'd want to be getting a full overview of the knowledge or skills that make up the thing that we're looking at. For our last kind of validity, we can look at criterion-related validity. But before we can talk about what that means, we should actually talk about what criterion measures are. A criterion measure is basically a measure of how well you will do in a particular situation given a score that has been generated by one of these tests. So for IQ, we could be looking at a criterion measure of how well you will do in a particular job based on what your IQ score was. So if the job is only going to be suitable for people with an IQ over 120, and we see a strong correlation between people with high IQs doing well in that particular job, then we could say that we have pretty good criterion measure. And we could go on to say that we have high criterion-related validity. So our criterion-related validity is looking at how well the test score does the test score predict our criterion measures? So how well does that IQ score predict success in a particular job? Now, let's take a moment and actually think critically about IQ scores and what they're used for and what they might correlate with. If we think back, IQ scores and all of these intelligence tests were originally becoming popular because people wanted to use them to predict academic and other kinds of achievement, say doing well in a job or becoming eminent. But does IQ actually correlate with any of those things? Overall, we do tend to see a positive correlation between IQ and academic performance. So an R of 0.6 in high school students, which says that those who tend to have higher IQs tend to do better in high school courses. The strength of this correlation drops a little bit as we get into university. So instead of a 0.6 correlation, in university you tend to see a 0.3 to a 0.5. But it's still a positive relationship between IQ and success in that environment. Now, it's a good idea to point out here that a 0.6 is a far cry from a perfect correlation of an R of 1.0. So this is saying that it's a moderate correlation. And so we should take into consideration that this means that you don't have to be intelligent to do well in university. And being intelligent doesn't guarantee that you will do well in university. There's been lots of debate, especially recently, about different types of entrance exams. I'm most familiar with the GRE, the General Record Examinations, and it's a standardized test that's often used for students trying to get into graduate school. The problem is that there's a lot of debate as to whether or not this test is accurately predicting success in grad school. And we see something similar with the SATs. And the scores for these, the correlations between your score and success in what it's getting you into, tend to be positive, but not overwhelming in strength. So they're just enough to justify having these tests as a sort of entrance exam to getting into a particular program, but there's a lot of talk more recently about these maybe being not the best method of determining whether someone deserves to be in a program or not. But that's a little bit of a tangent. We can also talk about, does intelligence have any kind of correlation or predictive ability with things like success in the workplace is probably what I'm trying to say there. And again, we tend to see this positive correlation where people with higher general intelligence tend to succeed more in the workplace. There have been lots and lots of studies looking at this, but generally, people with a higher IQ tend to earn more in the workplace. And this pattern seems to be stronger for more complicated jobs. So jobs that are more mentally intensive show a stronger divide between those that have a higher intelligence doing really well and those who have a lower intelligence not doing quite as well in that particular field. And so the take home from a lot of these studies is that intelligence predicts performance in a job a lot better than job experience or particular skills an individual has, or even their personality traits. So intelligence is a pretty strong predictor in this case. And intelligence can predict other things, where people with higher intelligence seem to show a better recovery from brain injuries, and even go so far as to what's on the screen here, where it shows a correlation with lifespan. So if we look at this graph here, we have age across the bottom here, and percentage alive. So this is a survivability type curve. So we have our purple line here, and that's people in the lowest 25% in terms of IQ, versus our green curve, which is people in the highest 25% for IQ. And our green line, the people who have a higher IQ, survive longer. So more of them are alive as time goes on, seen by the higher score on this percentage alive. And so the purple line for the people in the lowest 25%, they show a sharper decline where more of them pass away earlier on. Whether IQ is the cause of this, we can't say, because this is a correlation, not an experiment. But it's interesting to note that intelligence correlates with so many different things. Our last method of evaluating these psychometric tests is standardization. So this is going along with validity and reliability. Our third item is standardization. And when we talk about standardization, we have two distinct meanings that we can be discussing. The first is the development of norms. Norms are test scores that are derived from a relevant sample that are specifically used to evaluate an individual's score. So by collecting these norms, we develop a standard, a baseline to compare any individual to. And by allowing us to compare an individual's score to that baseline, it gives more meaning to the individual score. We can actually look at an example of that on the next slide, where we have what the textbook calls the bell curve of intelligence. When you give IQ tests to large populations, you tend to see the same pattern, no matter which population it is that you're applying this test to. We see this normal distribution where most individuals, the peak of our curve, tend to fall in the middle around that 100 mark, and then we have this drop off, a nice normal curve or a bell curve, where we have sort of the bulk of the population is average, and then some are at the low end of the spectrum and some are at the higher end of the spectrum, but it's this nice symmetrical curve that drops off to both sides. And with the way that this one here is labeled, we see that in this light blue section under the very peak of our curve, about 47%, or almost half of a population, tend to score in the range of average, between a 90 and a 110 IQ score. Then we see about 15% fall from 80 to 90, about 18 similar from 110 to 120, and so on and so forth. You can break down all these little sections. And so this standardization, this background of norms, allows us to look at how an individual would score compared to the rest of the population. If someone tells you that they have an IQ of 120, then you know how they compare to the rest of the population based on our standardization here. The second meaning that we have when we talk about standardization is the idea of controlled procedures. A good experiment should take place in a controlled environment or a standardized environment. And if this is happening, you're controlling for extraneous factors. You're holding all of our other potential confounding variables constant. So if you've ever gone and written a standardized test, they usually occur in a room that's fairly quiet, where you're given a booklet that's the same as everyone else's booklet, the same pencil as everyone else, or maybe you're doing it on the same computer as everyone else. So by holding all of those other variables constant, you're sure, or more sure, that the differences that you're seeing in test scores are coming from the performance of the individual writing the test. One of the ways that we can standardize how these tests are written is by using explicit instructions and procedures. So maybe at the start of the test, the person conducting the test has a script that they have to read, and they have to read it word for word to try and account for any differences that might come from your performance on the test if you were given different instructions. Maybe you're going to be given the test in the same order, so that the order of the different parts of the test don't affect your score. All of these things can be controlled for. All of these things can be standardized. Now, despite all of this talk of the standardization and validity and reliability of tests, and using IQ tests as our example, we're actually seeing a change in our general IQ scores of populations over time. So since 1910, we've seen a rise of 28 points on average in IQ scores. And in Britain, we're seeing the same pattern, 28 points increase in IQ since 1942. This phenomena with a rising curve is sometimes called the Flynn effect. And so this raises the question of, are we actually getting smarter as humans? And the short answer is, we're really not sure. This pattern seems to be occurring in all different cultures, all different populations. There's no difference between the sexes, though there are some people who say that the rise is larger in women than in men, but people can't seem to agree on that point. So it seems to be happening everywhere, and we're not quite sure why. The standing theories seem to be that, well, maybe as a whole, people around the world are having better nutrition. Our availability of food that would help us grow and develop and have our minds grow and develop seems to be getting better. Maybe our environment is better. There's more access to education. Our schools have more resources. Textbooks have more information in them. Maybe that's driving this. It could be technological advances. People have access to the internet now and can learn things on their own. They don't have to rely on school. So all of these are potential solutions or potential reasons for this rise in IQ, but we really don't know why this is happening. We just know that it does seem to be happening, and it seems to be fairly universal, which is kind of cool. Now, to wrap up this section, we're going to talk fairly briefly about how we can go about assessing intelligence in non-Western cultures. Because it's important to note that throughout our history and all of our discussions to this point, we started talking about measuring intelligence in France, then we moved to the US. Most of our measures of intelligence focus on Western cultures, focus on North America and Europe, and that tends to leave behind everywhere else on the planet. So we can't get a full idea of intelligence and measuring intelligence if we don't consider all of the other places that people exist where we can measure intelligence. Now, the downside is, if you're a researcher that wants to research intelligence in non-Western cultures, you really lack a lot of the tools that you could be using if you were studying intelligence in Western cultures. And that's because most of our standardized intelligence tests, things like the WACE or the Stanford-Binet test, all draw on different cognitive skills that are essential to Western culture. So they're skills that are related to Western education, to doing well in our schools. But those values aren't necessarily the same in other cultures. Someone who is not from a Western culture, but is tested using a Western biased intelligence test, would score lower on that test simply because the way that they learn, the way that their environment has shaped them to view things, is very, very different than how people in Western cultures view things. So it can cause an undeserved lower score and isn't really a valid measure of intelligence for those non-Western cultures. So if this is so challenging, how can you measure intelligence in non-Western cultures? The first of the approaches that you could go with is to use problems that aren't specifically tied to the knowledge base of any one culture. So you could look at the ability to recognize stimulus patterns or make connections between different objects. An example of this would be the Raven progressive matrix, which is seen on this page here. So this test is often used to measure fluid intelligence, and this isn't tied specifically to the knowledge base of any one culture. So in this task, you would be asked to look at the symbols that are presented here and come up with the rules so that you could figure out which image, which of these 8 symbols fits with the general rule that we're seeing with all of these other symbols. So which of these would complete the pattern that you're seeing here. A second method would be to actually create an intelligence test that has measures tailored to the kinds of knowledge that are valued in the culture you're looking at. So instead of using our Western tailored intelligence tests, you could use one that's been designed specifically for whichever culture you're interested in. This approach is a little bit challenging because you then have to completely redesign a test and come up with questions, come up with measures that are going to fit with that particular culture. So not many test makers go that route, but it is an option. All right. Now at the very end of this section, the textbook revisits the ideas that it revisits the ideas that Galton was talking about at the very beginning of this chapter, trying to look at that correlation between certain physical measures and intelligence. And specifically, if we look at brain size and intelligence, we know that our brain is the central location that seems to run all of our activities related to intelligence. And over evolutionary time, we have evolved larger and larger brains as our behaviors became more and more complicated. And we especially, in humans, see an advance in our cerebral cortex and frontal lobes, the parts that are involved in our more advanced thought-based activities. And we can see this by comparing the size of human skulls to some of our ancestors in the fossil record. But that's across species and across evolutionary time. Within humans as a species right now, we don't see this relationship continued, which relates back to why Galton's original research was thrown aside. There is no correlation between head size or brain volume and intelligence. One of the proposed reasons for this is that absolute brain volume might not be a good indicator of intelligence because we all have approximately the same number of neurons. What could be the difference between someone who is more intelligent or less intelligent could be how those neurons are connected. So a more efficient connection map in your brain might lead you to be more intelligent. So efficiency might be what's driving our intelligence, as opposed to just brain volume. And though we'll be talking about gender differences in the next part of this chapter, we can talk very briefly here about gender differences in how our brains operate. So males tend to have greater information processing ability. They have more gray matter, which allows them to process information at a higher rate, whereas females tend to, on average, have greater connectivity. So they'll have more white matter, on average, than males will. And like I said, in the next section, we'll talk more about what that might mean in terms of abilities as they relate to intelligence.